Death, the Great Adventure. Esoteric. Prologue. Ponder most carefully and sanely upon the so-called enigma of death. It is an enigma to man, but not an enigma to disciples and knowers of the wisdom. During the next cycle, death will become a normal and understood process. Understanding death, similarities between the near-death experience and the esoteric process of dying. The Tibetan master Djwhal Khul says that the reign of the fear of death is well nigh ended, and we shall soon enter upon a period of knowledge and of certainty, which will cut away the ground from under all our fears. In dealing with the fear of death, there is little to be done except to raise the whole subject onto a more scientific level, and in the scientific sense, teach people to die. There is a technique of dying, just as there is of living, but this technique has been lost very largely in the West, and is almost lost except in a few centers of knowers in the East. More of this can perhaps be dealt with later, but the thought of the needed approach to this subject can rest in the minds of the students who read this, and perhaps as they study and read and think, material of interest will come their way, which could be gradually assembled and published. In 1980, I began compiling passages on death and dying from the 24 books of Alice Bailey and the Tibetan master Djwhal Khul. My manuscript was then edited by an esteemed colleague. In 1985, Lucis Publishing Company in New York published my compilation entitled Death, the Great Adventure. Then in 1992, I compiled a 300-page manuscript entitled Understanding Death, Similarities Between the Near-Death Experience and the Esoteric Process of Dying. I revised the manuscript in 2017. Today's presentation is based on both of my compilations on death. In his 1975 bestseller, Life After Life, Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. coined the term near-death experience to describe what happens to people who temporarily die and are then resuscitated. He continued to examine the near-death experience in subsequent books. A near-death experience, or NDE, is what happens to people who come close to dying, who come near death. This experience is usually unexpected, occurring without warning to those who are not prepared for it. Dr. George Ritchie Jr. is a psychiatrist who wrote of his own experience of being in a temporary state of clinical death during World War II in his book, Return from Tomorrow. Dr. Kenneth Ring, a psychologist at the University of Connecticut, reported on his rigorous scientific investigation of the NDE in Life at Death, and his search for the significance of the NDE in Heading Toward Omega and Lessons from the Light. Dr. Melvin Morse is a pediatrician who examined the near-death experiences of children in his book, Closer to the Light. British psychologist Margot Gray had a near-death experience and later reported on her investigation of others' NDEs in Return from Death. Dr. Phyllis Atwater had 3 NDEs in the course of 1 year. She told of her own experience in Coming Back to Life. Betty Eadie described her NDE in her best-selling book, Embraced by the Light. Daniel Brinkley recounted his 2 NDEs in Saved by the Light. Dr. Eben Alexander is a neurosurgeon who wrote of his week-long NDE in Proof of Heaven. The word esoteric is from the Greek esoteros, which means inner. Its opposite is exoteric, from exoteros, denoting that which is outer. In the past, the unenlightened masses were taught the exoteric or outer, revealed, literal teaching, while the initiates earned the right to receive the esoteric or inner, concealed, spiritual doctrine. This esoteric doctrine is found at the heart of the world's major religious traditions. And is also known as the mysteries, and was taught in the various mystery schools of antiquity. In Mark 4:11, we find Jesus speaking to his disciples, and he said unto them, Unto you, the initiated disciples, it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, the esoteric or inner doctrine. But unto them that are without, the uninitiated masses, all these things are done in parables, the exoteric or outer teaching. This esoteric doctrine is known under many names. These are some of them. As I just noted, those undergoing a near-death experience are usually caught unaware and are ill-prepared for the experience of the after-death states. The esotericists, on the other hand, use specific scientific meditative techniques to explore the inner planes of consciousness and to observe the deceased human beings functioning there. These esoteric meditative techniques for exploring the after-death states were taught by the Buddha and are still practiced today in certain places in Asia. In Tibet, these ancient methods are known as Po Wa, which translates as the transference of consciousness at the time of death. In his book, The Other Side of Death, Charles Leadbeater recounts how he was taught by great teachers in India to raise his consciousness to higher planes of being, enabling him to see and speak with the deceased in their own worlds. Annie Besant was a British author and a seer on the after-death planes who reported her observations in such theosophical classics as The Ancient Wisdom, Death and After, and Reincarnation. Helena Blavatsky was a gifted Russian explorer of the subtler inner worlds. She related many of her findings in The Secret Doctrine and The Key to Theosophy. Drawal Kul is a Tibetan Lama who has mastered the esoteric process of dying and was one of the teachers who taught Leadbeater how to communicate with the deceased on the inner planes. As I mentioned earlier, Alice Bailey was a British author who worked closely with Drawal Kul in revealing many insights into the after-death experience in their 24 books on esotericism. Max Heindel, a Rosicrucian investigator of the esoteric process of dying, reported his findings in the Rosicrucian Cosmoconception. Manly P. Hall was an esoteric philosopher who wrote about the after-death experience in many of his books, including The Secret Teachings of All Ages and Death to Rebirth. James Perkins was a theosophical author who wrote of his own NDE in experiencing reincarnation and of the esoteric process of dying and through death to rebirth. Arthur Powell created theosophical compilations on the four settled bodies that we experience more fully after we withdraw from the physical body. E. Norman Pearson wrote about the after-death planes in his classic Introduction to Theosophy, Space, Time, and Self. Dr. Stanislav Grof has examined the experience of dying in such books as The Human Encounter with Death and Beyond Death. Dr. Grof suggests that the most famous of the Books of the Dead are the Egyptian Pert M. Hru, or Coming Forth by Day, and the Tibetan Bordeaux Thodol, Liberation Through Hearing in the Intermediate State. In his book, Heading Toward Omega, Dr. Kenneth Ring wrote this about the near-death experience, or NDE, and the scientific meditative disciplines used for entering the higher planes of consciousness. NDEs, in my view, represent a brief but powerful thrust into a higher state of consciousness. Unlike the meditative disciplines we have alluded to, however, the NDE is not a breakthrough that occurs as a result of a long period of voluntary spiritual training. Rather, it is an involuntary and sudden propulsion, usually without warning or preparation, into a realm of profound spiritual illumination. In this respect, the NDE resembles a full-blown mystical experience. In his first two books, Life After Life and Reflections on Life After Life, Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. presented 19 elements of the NDE. Esotericists reveal that in our solar system there are 7 planes of matter of increasing degrees of density. Each of these 7 major planes is composed of 7 subplanes. To visually depict these 7 levels of conscious awareness, they must be stacked upon one another so that they appear to move downward from above. In actuality, all the planes are interpenetrating and therefore occupy the same space. Esotericist James Perkins writes that since finer grades of matter permeate denser levels, any number of increasingly subtler planes may occupy a given point in physical space. In order to move from one level to another, consciousness is increased in vibratory velocity rather than transported somewhere else in space. Daniel Brinkley recalled that during his NDE, we began to move upward. I could hear a hum as my body began to vibrate at a higher rate of speed. Esotericists note that the esoteric process of dying or withdrawal occurs on the 3 lower planes of our solar system: the physical, the emotional or astral, and the mental. The physical and mental planes are both divided into 2 sections of greater and lesser density or frequency of vibration. The lower 4 mental subplanes, along with the 14 subplanes of the emotional and physical planes, provide the field of functioning of one's personality or lower self. Just above it, we see the higher self, the spiritual ego or soul, and the causal body that is its home on the higher subplanes of the mental plane. Although I speak of the esoteric process of dying, or EPD, it is more accurately referred to as the esoteric process of withdrawal or abstraction. It is the incarnating soul's process of withdrawing or abstracting the life and consciousness aspects that results in the process of dying or disintegration that occurs to the forms or bodies which the soul has been confined in for the purpose of gaining knowledge and experience in the three lower worlds. Just focus on the highlighted areas. To give you a sense of how closely related these two perspectives actually are, here are some passages from page 12 of my revised Understanding Death compilation. I wish there were time to provide numerous examples of the similarities between the two perspectives of each of the topics of the esoteric process of withdrawal that we are about to explore. But due to time constraints, I will only offer an example or two to indicate the similarities. Just be aware that for every example that I provide, there are probably 4 or 5 others that I haven't mentioned. One of the first qualities that we discover about death in the research of both groups is its ineffability. Dr. Raymond Moody reports that the persons involved uniformly characterize their experience as ineffable, that is, inexpressible. Many have made remarks to the effect that there are just no words to express what I am trying to say. Esotericist Charles Leadbeater recounts the utter inadequacy of all attempts at description, the hopelessness of any effort to put into human words the ineffable glories of the heaven world. We also discover that there is an auditory announcement that the dying process has begun. Dr. Moody calls this element of the NDE hearing the news. The NDEers hear doctors or others pronounce them dead. Master Djwal Khul tells us that the soul sounds forth a word of withdrawal from its own plane, and immediately an interior process and reaction is evoked within the man on the physical plane. As we saw from the earlier examples, both perspectives of the dying process describe it as one characterized by peace and quiet. These two views of the dying process reveal that the pronounced grieving of loved ones is disruptive to the deceased and can interfere with their continued progress through the process of withdrawal that is intended by the soul. One of Dr. Moody's NDEers declared that, "I felt as though I had been called back, magnetized back through the love of my sister and husband. Since then, I have believed that other people can draw you back." Esotericist Charles Hampton wrote that the grief of friends attracts the attention of the dead, and this tends to draw the departed again into touch with earth. It is cruel to draw to earth one who yearns to be free. It interrupts his progress to try to arouse in him any desire for further earthly life which he has left. Prayers, however, are helpful and facilitate the progress of the deceased through the after-death states. Betty Eadie learned during her NDE that our prayers can benefit both spiritual beings as well as people on earth. If there is reason to fear for a departed person's spirit, if there is a reason to believe their transition may be difficult or unwanted, we can pray for them and enlist spiritual help. Esotericist Annie Besant notes that religion has wisely commanded prayers for the dying, for these preserve calm and stimulate unselfish aspirations directed to their helping, and these, like all loving thoughts, protect and shield. Along with the auditory announcement that confirms the beginning of the dying process, there is also a sound that is heard at the start of the process. Dr. Moody says that a woman tells how as she lost consciousness, she heard a loud ringing. It could be described as a buzzing. We should recall that the physical plane in the physical body is divided into two parts. The dense physical body is composed of matter of the three lower physical subplanes, and the etheric physical body consists of matter from the four higher physical subplanes. Dr. Raymond Moody suggests that there must be some mechanism, bodily or spiritual or maybe both, that releases the psyche, the soul, from the body upon physical death. He reported that one NDEer said he studied his hands while he was in this state and saw them to be composed of tubes of light with tiny structures in them. He could see tubes of light up his arms. The Tibetan Master DK reveals that certain physiological events take place in connection with the heart and affect the bloodstream, the nervous system, and the endocrine system. A vibration runs along the nadis, the etheric counterpart of the nervous system. They respond to the directing word of withdrawal, react to the pull of the soul, free themselves from the nervous system, and then organize themselves for abstraction. The glands, in response to the call of death, inject into the bloodstream a substance which in turn affects the heart. This substance in the blood is regarded as death-dealing and is one of the basic causes of coma and loss of consciousness. Betty Eadie said that during her NDE, I felt a surge of energy. It was almost as if I felt a pop or release inside me, and my spirit was suddenly drawn out through my chest and pulled upwards as if by a giant magnet. One of Moody's respondents noted there was a vibration all around his body that separated him from his body. Master DK tells us that a psychic tremor is established which has the effect of loosening or breaking the connection between the nadis and the nervous system. The etheric body is thereby detached from its dense sheath, though still interpenetrating every part of it. It withdraws from the extremities toward the required door of exit and focuses itself in the area around that door for the final pull of the directing soul. One of Moody's respondents said, "My being or myself or my spirit or whatever you'd like to label it, I could sort of feel it rise out of me, out through my head." And as we just noted, Betty Eadie said she felt a pop or release inside me, and my spirit was suddenly drawn out through my chest and pulled upward as if by a giant magnet. Joel Kuhl reveals that there are three exits from the physical body that are used by various groups of people. One, the exit in the head, used by the intellectual type, by disciples and initiates of the world. Two, the exit in the heart, used by the kindly, well-meaning man or woman who is a good citizen, an intelligent friend, and a philanthropic worker. Three, the exit in the region of the solar plexus, used by the emotional, unintelligent, unthinking man, and by those whose animal nature is strong. Dr. Melvin Morse interviewed an NDEer who declared that he looked down and saw that he was linked to his body by a silver cord. Another of his respondents said he looked down from the ceiling and saw that he was attached to his body on the operating table by a silvery umbilical cord. Ecclesiastes 12:6 refers to the silver cord that is loosed and the golden bowl that is broken. Esotericist Charles Hampton says that the silver cord is composed of numerous etheric threads that are attached to the top of the head, and the golden bowl is constructed from the life forces that have withdrawn from the body and are now intensely brilliant as they are concentrated in the head for exit. Dr. Moody reports that the NDEer may find himself looking upon his own physical body from a point outside of it. One of his respondents noted, "I was out of my body. There's no doubt about it, because I could see my own body there on the operating table. My soul was out." Esotericist Charles Leadbeater declares that the actual definition of death is the full and final separation of the etheric double from the dense body. When a man withdraws from his dense body at death, he takes with him the etheric part of that vehicle. Phyllis Atwater reports that invariably survivors come to describe their physical bodies in abstract, more objective and detached terms, as if it were a garment they wear. She said of one of her own NDEs, "My body was not me. I was me. A body was something I had once worn, like someone wears a jacket or an old coat." Esotericist Charles Hampton declares that the body is a garment, and what we call death is but the laying aside of a worn-out garment. It is no more the end of mind and soul than it is the end of the body when we remove an overcoat. Dr. Atwater also notes that invariably survivors come to describe their physical bodies in abstract, more objective and detached terms as if it were a house they reside in. Esotericist E. Norman Pearson notes that death, so-called, is the time of release, when the soul once more is liberated from its house of bondage. There is a swoon or loss of consciousness as one exits the physical body. One of Dr. Moody's respondents noted, "I had a heart attack and I found myself in a black void, and I knew I had left my body behind." Charles Leadbeater observed that when he dies, he draws out with him the etheric counterpart of the physical body, and consequently has usually at least a moment of unconsciousness while he is freeing himself from it. The Tibetan Book of the Dead calls it a swoon. Both groups declare that consciousness is exactly the same after death, that death in no way changes who they are. The only difference is that they are no longer functioning through a dense physical body. One of Dr. Moody's respondents noted, "I thought I was dead. My thought and consciousness were just like they are in real life." Charles Leadbeater writes that character is not in the slightest degree changed by death. The man's thoughts, emotions, and desires are exactly the same as before. He is in every way the same man, minus his physical body. Dr. Moody reports that many people don't realize that the near-death experience they are having has anything to do with death. They find themselves floating above their body, looking at it from a distance. It doesn't make any sense to them, and they become very confused. Esotericist Max Heindel writes that it not infrequently happens, however, that such people are for a long time unaware of what has happened to them. They do not realize that they have died. They know that they are able to move and think. It is sometimes even a very hard matter to get them to believe that they are really dead. They realize that something is different, but that they are not able to understand what it is. Members of both groups find themselves or their subjects in another body after death. The NDEers usually refer to it as the spiritual body, and the esotericists call it the etheric body. It is weightless and less substantial than their physical body. It both resembles the shape of the physical body and also extends beyond it in the form of an aura. One of Dr. Ring's respondents declared, "I slowly rose and expanded into the full stature of a man. I seemed to be translucent, of a bluish cast, and perfectly naked." Esotericist Charles Hampton states that the etheric body is a replica or double of the physical body, in matter finer and more tenuous than the dense body. Its appearance is that of a bluish-white mist. Both groups realize that all forms and beings in the universe are connected and compose part of one great life. Master D.K. says it is the etheric nature of all forms that connects them to one another. The respondents from both perspectives say that the spiritual or etheric body floats up above the physical body. Dr. Moody writes that it is invariably reported that this spiritual body is also weightless. Most NDEers first notice this when they find themselves floating right up to the ceiling of the room or into the air. Many describe a floating sensation or a feeling of weightlessness in association with their new bodies. The Tibetan Book of the Dead reports that when the etheric double finally quits the dense body, it does not go far away, but usually floats over it. Master D.K. tells us that when the life thread is withdrawn by the soul at death, the living atoms separate, the body falls apart, and disintegration ensues, with the atomic lives returning to the reservoir of power, to the bosom of living matter from whence it came. The Tibetan master also predicts that before so very long, burial in the ground will be against the law, and cremation will be enforced, and this is a health and sanitation measure. Those unhappy psychic spots, called cemeteries, will eventually disappear. By the use of fire, all forms are dissolved. The quicker the human physical vehicle is destroyed, the quicker is its hold upon the withdrawing soul broken. Where cremation is the rule, both the physical and the etheric bodies are promptly destroyed, and their substance returned to their respective reservoirs of energies. Dr. Moody states that NDEers can understand what the doctors and nurses are trying to convey to each other, but when they try to talk to them or other people present, no one is able to see or hear them. Esotericist James Perkins declares that those who have passed on should understand their situation when they try futilely to communicate with friends on the physical plane, only to find that they cannot be heard or seen. Arthur Powell relates that as the days pass, the higher principles gradually disengage themselves from the etheric double, and the latter then becomes in its turn an etheric corpse which remains near the dense one, both disintegrating together. During her NDE, Betty Eadie discovered that every memory, thought, and experience is imprinted in our cells. One of Dr. Ring's subjects said they were stored in his brain. Dr. Eben Alexander writes, "My NDE had convinced me that there is a secret part of ourselves that is recording every last aspect of our earthly lives, and that this recording process commences at the very beginning." There are 5 permanent atoms, also called seed atoms by the Rosicrucians, one on the atomic or highest subplane of each of the 5 lower planes. Charles Leadbeater declares that these 5 permanent atoms are attached to the monad or spirit aspect on the second highest plane and serve as a repository of experience on each of these planes through all that individual's series of incarnations. Max Heindel reveals that the physical permanent atom resides in the left ventricle of the heart. At death, it rises to the brain by way of the pneumogastric nerve, leaving the dense body together with the higher vehicles by way of the sagittal suture. The physical permanent atom eventually returns to the soul's causal body, thereby enriching it with the gains of that particular incarnation's physical plane experiences, and to await the individual's next physical incarnation. After withdrawing from the disintegrating etheric body and before awakening in his emotional or astral body, the individual again experiences a swoon or period of unconsciousness. However, not all individuals pass easily from the physical to the emotional worlds. Some are so attached to a person, place, habit, or thing on the physical plane that they become temporarily trapped in their etheric bodies. Dr. Moody states that several people have reported to me that at some point they glimpsed other beings who seemed to be trapped in an apparently most unfortunate state of existence because they were unable to surrender their attachments to the physical world. One man recounted that the spirits he saw apparently couldn't progress to the other side because they seemed bound to some particular object, person, or habit. Secondly, all remarked that these beings appeared dulled, that their consciousness seemed somehow limited in contrast with that of others. Esotericist James Perkins relates that we depart from the physical world clothed and conscious in our sheath of etheric matter. The transition into the astral or emotional world should be swift and usually is. This may not be true, however, for the person who tries desperately to cling to the physical world and its desired objects, even though these are fading into a gray insubstantiality. Charles Leadbeater notes that he lives for a while in a dim gray world of restlessness and discomfort, in a world of heavy fog in which he wanders, lost and helpless. In time, however, he must let go, for the etheric double begins to disintegrate, and then he slips quite happily into the fuller and wider life of the emotional plane. Both perspectives of the dying process also agree that suicide is a grievous mistake that solves nothing and actually makes things worse with the new penalties, the additional unpleasant karma, and the retarded soul progress that the individuals who take their own lives impose upon themselves. Those attempting or successfully committing suicide are forced to repeat the events leading up to and the actual act of the suicide over and over again with ghastly persistence until their natural time of death on earth is finally reached, sometimes years or even decades later. One of Dr. Moody's subjects stated, "I would go through it once, and at the end I would think, oh, I'm glad that's over. And then it would start all over again, and I would think, oh no, not this again." Another of his respondents stressed that during his NDE, caused by a suicide attempt, that there were horrific beings clutching and clawing at him. It was something like descending into Dante's Inferno. He had a claustrophobic, hostile, nightmarish NDE without the slightest positive experience. Esotericist Annie Besant notes that a suicide will repeat automatically the feelings of despair and fear which preceded his self-murder and go through the act and the death struggle time after time with ghastly persistence. Arthur Powell writes that one reason why suicide is such a grievous mistake is that it constitutes a direct refusal to work out the karma selected for that particular incarnation and merely postpones the trouble as well as generating new karma of an unpleasant nature. Powell emphasizes that the karmic consequences of suicide are usually momentous. They are certain to affect the next life and probably more lives than one. Charles Hampton states that for the suicide, there's an intolerable, heavy, leaden feeling of being perpetually tired, also due to the inability to get free from the earthbound condition. He will remain in the atmosphere of the earth until his time period of physical life is exhausted, for that is fixed. He will be earthbound. When the earth period is ended, Then the normal life after death in the astral or emotional world will begin. We will now consider more closely the noise or the sounds that are reported in the after-death realms. NDEers describe them as a ringing, buzzing, or humming sound. Neurosurgeon Eben Alexander says of his NDE, Om was a sound I remembered hearing associated with that omniscient, omnipotent, and unconditionally loving God. Master DK tells us that the Om rightly sounded releases the soul. It is the sound of liberation, the great note of resurrection. The Tibetan Book of the Dead advises that from the midst of that radiance, the natural sound of reality, reverberating like 1,000 thunders simultaneously sounding, will come. That is the natural sound of thine own real self. Both groups report that on the inner planes there is music that is pleasant, soothing, beautiful, and majestic. One of Dr. Ring's respondents noted that my ears were filled with a music so beautiful no composer could ever duplicate it. It too was not of this world. It was soothing, gentle, and warm, and seemed to come from a source deep within me. Esotericist Arthur Powell wrote that many of the great composers are there, pouring forth far greater music than any which they knew on earth. Much of the inspiration of earthly musicians is in fact but a faint echo of the music on the inner planes which they have dimly sensed. Both groups report that in the after-death worlds, the normal boundaries of time, space, and body are altered or transcended. Dr. Kenneth Ring reports that for most respondents, body, time, and space simply disappear, or to put it another way, they are no longer meaningful constructs. One of Dr. Moody's respondents reported, and of course our world, the one we're living in now, is three-dimensional, but the next one definitely isn't. Esotericist E. Norman Pearson cautions that there are three great illusions in life which we must face and conquer. The illusion of space as dimension, the illusion of time as succession, and the illusion of self as separation. In the after-death state, one becomes like the yogi that Alice Bailey describes. Neither space nor time can hold him, nor can the material form imprison him. Dr. Moody reports that often concurrently with the occurrence of the noise, people have the sensation of being pulled very rapidly through a dark space of some kind. Many different words are used to describe this space. Moody says, I've heard this space described as a cave, a well, a trough, an enclosure, a tunnel, a funnel, a vacuum, a void, a sewer, a valley, and a cylinder. Master Dwal-Kul reveals that at the top of the head there is an esoteric door of departure through which the soul withdraws the consciousness aspect in the hours of sleep, and the consciousness aspect plus the life thread at the moment of death. It is this door through which the imprisoned soul and the body can emerge and pass into higher states of consciousness. This door has been called the funnel or the channel for the sound, the trumpet through which the escaping Aum can pass. This door is found upon the etheric level. The color of this door is indigo or midnight blue. Dr. Ring states that according to consciousness researcher Isaac Bentov, the tunnel effect is a psychological phenomenon whereby the consciousness experiences motion from one level to another. It is the process of adjustment of consciousness from one plane of reality to another. Thus what Bentov appears to be saying is that the tunnel or darkness is an intermediate or transitional zone occurring between levels of consciousness. Tunnel effects, then, are merely the mind's experience of transitions through states of consciousness. The Tibetan Book of the Dead calls this a swoon or temporary loss of consciousness. Some respondents from both perspectives of the dying process do not use tunnels or doors to move to higher planes of consciousness. Instead, they describe heavenly stairways or ladders employed for their ascent. These seem to resemble the ladders of Jacob in Genesis and the Egyptian sun god Ra. A mother told Dr. Moody about her son's transition. One of the last things he said was that he saw a beautiful staircase going upward. He put his mother's mind at peace when he told her that he thought he was going up those stairs. Wallace Budge, the translator of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, wrote that the souls of the dead made their way to their abode in the other world by a ladder. This concludes Death, the Great Adventure, Esoteric,